Today, we're going to talk about something super cool: how to shape your behavior without involving you. So the core problem that we have is that we have ideas of what we should do, but we keep on getting in the way. So you have certain goals, you have certain desires, you have certain ambitions, but the problem of choice enters the picture, right? Because you would rather do something else. And so the question is, can we remove you from the equation? Because if we removed you from the equation, would you act in the right way? So this may sound kind of weird, but if we stop and sort of think about it, a lot of the problems that we have in life are because of the choices we make. So there's like thing A that I should do. This is maybe study or work out or eat healthy or something like that. And instead, what happens is my mind or I make a choice to do something else. And so a lot of our problems in life come from the choices that we make. And so if we look at improving our lives, can we actually improve our lives by actually removing ourselves from the decision-making process? And that may sound like a weird goal to have, but if we look at some modern theories of neuroscience, basically a lot of neuroscience tells us that we don't have free will, that actions are deterministic, that the choices we make aren't real choices, but they're actually calculations that are performed by our neurons. And if our neurons decide to do something, then we end up doing it. That free will is essentially an illusion. So I started thinking about this concept quite a bit and started to realize, okay, hold on a second. If there is no free will and everything is just neurons making calculations, can we change the calculations that our neurons make? Can we essentially program our brains in a particular way to shape our behavior? Because there's no such thing as free will. There's no such thing as choice, which means everything is like levers being pulled. If I flick the light switch on, let's say the lights turn off. And if I hit another button, the lights turn back on. Can we basically do that in our brain? Because that's what a lot of neuroscientists claim. So I started looking into the research of the absence of free will and what are the neuroscientific mechanisms, because people must be making that conclusion based on certain experiments. We must have learned certain things about the brain and behavior that allow us to conclude or hypothesize that there's no such thing as free will. And if we understand the programming inside the brain, can we then utilize that programming in the same way that we can kind of program a computer to create the correct actions? So this is sort of what I investigated. And what I found was absolutely fascinating. Because as I was going through the literature, and there's a ton of it, we'll share a couple papers with y'all today, but as I was going through the literature, I started to stumble upon a realization. So I work with a lot of very successful people, and I also work with a lot of very unsuccessful people. And as I was looking through this literature about deterministic behavior from the brain, I started to realize that, holy crap, a lot of my very successful clients, patients, utilize these mechanisms and they don't even realize it. A lot of my very unsuccessful clients and patients, these are people who are like degenerate gamers, failure to launch, even people who are homeless, do not utilize these mechanisms. And it was crazy how clear this was, because once I read it in the literature, I hadn't even realized that my successful, like my high performers that I work with, these are people like CEOs, like heads of billion-dollar companies, content creators with millions and millions of followers. They all do this stuff. So today, what we're going to do is share those deterministic principles. And the crazy thing is that this is not usually where we focus. It's not about motivation. It's not about convincing yourself. It's not about logic or anything like that. They're actually discrete things that these people do that aren't really things even. We'll get to it in a second. I know it sounds kind of weird. That I see very commonly in people who are very successful. And we're going to outline some of those principles for you today. When people hear that we offer coaching at HG, their first question is like, what on earth even is that? So here's the basic problem. When you struggle with something in your life, you don't see the problem from the outside. You see it from the inside. The value of a coach is that they can look at your life from the outside. They can understand what's going on, and they can help guide you to improve things like motivation, accomplish short-term goals, and even increase a sense of purpose in life. And over the long term, we also see improvements in feelings of depression and anxiety. And the best part is we've had over 100,000 coaching sessions, and we incorporate that feedback to continually improve our program. So if y'all are interested in actually making a change in your life, check out the link in the description below. So just a quick disclaimer that this is sort of a combination of very basic science research, and then also like clinical experience. And what I've tried to do is tie the two together. So let's start with this concept that there is no such thing as free will. So this may sound kind of shocking, but this is actually an old idea. So back in 1983, Libet and colleagues made the assertion that the conscious experience of volition cannot trigger the initiation of action. It further suggests that conscious volition is an afterthought and not any part of the action-generating process at all. So people did a series of experiments, and we'll show you what that is, in 1983. And they basically concluded that the decision to act happens before any conscious decision is made or any awareness of a decision is made. So that the brain decides ahead of time what you're going to do, and then later your consciousness thinks that it basically makes a decision. But this is essentially an illusion of the mind. So what people were sort of looking at, they were doing this is a schematic of Libet's findings. And so this is the case of like some kind of motor movement they were making. And what they basically noticed was that there's this thing called a readiness potential. So like the decision in your brain gets made between 1 and 2 seconds before you act. And then they asked people, okay, like tell us when you decide to move. And the decision to move was about 200 milliseconds before you move. So basically they asked people like, okay, anytime you're going to like move your hand, just tell us when you've made the decision. Tell us when you've decided to move. And so what happened is people would decide, okay, like I'm going to move now. And that would happen about 200 milliseconds before they actually move. But what this experiment showed is that they could actually detect the movement, the decision to move, about 1 second before the actual movement. And so this is how they kind of concluded that we can detect that your brain has made the decision before you're even aware or before you believe you've made the decision. Now, this isn't the only experiment that has shown this. This experiment has been sort of carried out in different ways. So we'll sort of show you all a more recent experiment. I think this is from 2008 or 2018, where Soon et al. Concluded that the outcome of a decision can be encoded in the brain activity of prefrontal and parietal cortex up to 10 seconds before it enters awareness. So this is kind of crazy, but more recent research has shown that you can detect this decision up to 10 seconds before someone thinks that they made it. So the experiment that Soon did was very interesting. They just basically said, here's a lever, and you can press the lever with your right hand or your left hand. And then what they did is they measured blood flow to different parts of the brain. So we have this thing called the motor cortex, which is like how we move our fingers and stuff. And so what they were able to do is predict up to 10 seconds in advance. They would see blood flow go to a certain part of the brain, and they would be able to predict which hand the person would choose to push the lever with. So they could see that, okay, blood flow is going to the right hand, so this person is going to make a choice that they're going to press the lever with the right hand as opposed to the left hand. And they couldn't predict with 100% accuracy, but if you look at like what should be the prediction, it's basically a coin flip, right? It's random whether you pick right hand or left hand. They were able to predict with about 60% accuracy which hand someone would pick before they even knew which one they were going to pick. And the key thing still remains that if our brain works like this, how can we program ourselves so that our neurons move in the right direction? And we can essentially remove free will or consciousness or motivation or any of that crap from the equation. So the key takeaway here is that there does seem to be some evidence that conscious decision-making is not actually what happens. What a lot of people believe, what a lot of neuroscientists believe, is that your brain makes a decision, and the idea of free will is essentially an illusion that happens afterward. That your brain sort of concocts some idea of choice, but the decision is already made. So we're going to start with the original 1983 experiment, and this idea of something called a readiness potential, or in the original German, the Bereitschaftspotential, okay? So this is super cool. So the Bereitschaftspotential, or readiness potential, okay, is this thing that begins 1 second or more before the onset of movement and continues to rise up until just before the onset of muscle contraction. So what this basically means is that there's this weird thing called the readiness potential, which is sort of, subjectively, I would kind of describe this as working yourself up to the action. So if we look at people who are very successful, they're able to work themselves up to the action. Whereas people who are struggling with things like procrastination and delaying things and not doing the right things, they have difficulty working themselves up to it. So we have a subjective experience of this, and it turns out that there's a neuroscientific correlate. So the first thing that we want to do is harness the Bereitschaftspotential for our benefit. And then you may be wondering, how the hell do we do that? And that's where it's cool, because people have figured that out. So the more that the participant thinks about the action, the earlier and larger is the RP. Longer interaction intervals were associated with earlier and larger RPs, suggesting that the time available for the preparatory buildup may have a major influence on RP. Okay? So what does this mean? In our brain, we have this thing called the Bereitschaftspotential, or the RP. The RP determines whether we act or not. And so what we want to do is increase the RP, because the larger that the RP is, the more likely that we are to act. And this is what I've noticed about successful versus unsuccessful people. The high performers are the ones who give themselves a lot of time to work up to something. Whereas people who are low performers, less successful, have very small transitions. I'll give you all just a very simple example. So if you look at, I'm thinking about my life when I was a degenerate, I would bounce from one form of procrastination to another. I would never sit still during the day. I did nothing all day, but I wasn't actually sitting with myself, right? I'd play a game for 4 hours, and then I'd be like, okay, this is crazy. It's been too long. I'd hop in the shower, right? It's hop. It's not like move mindfully and slowly and carefully into the shower. It's hop into the shower, order some food, go pick it up, jump into a queue. Even the language that we use suggests that our transitions are very small. And if you pay attention to your life, what you'll find is that there is a correlation between rapid transitions and doing the wrong thing. I'm dating this person, and then I just broke up, and instead of spending time with myself and learning how to be healthy on my own, I'm going to rebound into another relationship. So it's so crazy that we sort of see this already in our lives. And when I work with people who are very successful, what I see is that they give themselves time. And this is going to be a key theme that we're going to focus on today, is that successful people focus on the transitions between action. And a lot of people who really struggle to do the right thing focus on the actions themselves. And that's what's really crazy, is it seems like our brain really decides the right things in between actions. So that's the first thing, is give yourself time. Very practically, spend a few minutes before you go from one activity to another activity. Now, this may sound kind of weird, because you may be thinking, what do I do in those 2 minutes? Do I need to think a particular thing? We'll get to those things. But basically, this is the crazy thing, is if the brain is deterministic, it's not clear to me that you need to think any particular thing. It's not like there's a right way of thinking or a wrong way of thinking. It is simply giving your brain the space to build its RP, and then let's see what happens. So we're now going to dive into something super cool. So if you look at a lot of people who struggle to be successful or be high performers, they struggle with avoidance, right? We do things like procrastinate. I don't want to do this task this time. I'll take care of it tomorrow. We all know about avoidance and procrastination. And then we had this stupid idea. We had this idea that, oh my God, what I need to do is overcome avoidance, right? Because then I can be like these disciplined people who are not avoiding tasks at all. So it turns out that this is wrong. It turns out that the reason that procrastination is so uniform is because avoidance is baked into our brain. The difference between high performers and low performers is high performers utilize their avoidance in one direction, and low performers utilize their avoidance in the wrong direction. The big difference is, what is it that they're choosing to avoid? So someone who is a high performer or very successful is much more likely to avoid wanting to do something in the future. So the way that they literally think is, I have this task to do. I don't want this task hanging over my head over the next week. I don't want to have to take care of this tomorrow. I want to avoid waiting. So this is key. What research shows us is that a huge part of volition is the avoidance of waiting. And I want you to think about things that you've done where you haven't procrastinated. If you really stop and pay attention, sometimes it's passion, sometimes it's inspiration, but a lot of times it's just, I don't want to deal with this shit tomorrow, so I might as well take care of it today, right? And this is the same idea behind ripping a Band-Aid right off. We don't want to belabor this over a long period of time that is extensive pain. So we just want to take care of it. Just get it done. I don't want to deal with it tomorrow. And that's literally what the science shows us, that some people do this. So participants made volitional actions as a means of avoiding random and potentially long waits for stimulus onset in a perceptual decision-making task. So I want y'all to understand this. The task isn't really that important, okay? The key thing here is that volitional actions are made as a means of avoidance. This is crazy, right? We have to really stop and think about this. This is not conquering avoidance. This is utilizing avoidance. So if we want to be more successful, if we want our performance to increase, we don't need to conquer avoidance. We actually need to channel it in the opposite direction. So spend a little bit of time thinking about avoiding this in the future. Ask yourself, hey, wouldn't it be fantastic if I didn't have to worry about this crap tomorrow? This is a question that I utilize a lot with my coaching clients, especially not the high-performing ones, but the low-performing ones, where I ask themselves, what is the world that you want to wake up in tomorrow, right? This is a key question to ask yourself. How do you want to wake up tomorrow? Do you want to have your fridge stocked with food? This is something that I did a lot. So when my wife and I first had kids, what I sort of noticed is that I had to go to the grocery store like at 10 o'clock at night. I was exhausted. I didn't want to go. I didn't feel like doing anything except for playing video games or falling asleep or whatever. But the main thing that got my ass to the grocery store is when I wake up tomorrow morning, do I want to have nothing healthy and nutritious to eat? Am I going to go pick up breakfast tacos, which are delicious, but are not very good for me? And so it was even the avoidance of the problems tomorrow that actually got me to get my ass up and go to the grocery store at 10 p.m. at night. This is something that high performers do. They're just as avoidant as you or me. The big difference is it is what they choose to avoid. So start to choose to avoid different things. And what you'll find is that it is very easy for you to do that because you're not trying to conquer the circuit in your brain. The brain naturally wants to do it, and we want to move in line with that. The next thing we're going to talk about is superstition. And I love this so much. This is what I found so fascinating about looking at these research studies on volition and action and human choice. So superstition is dumb. We all know that superstitions are false. We have tons of scientific evidence that show us that if you wear your lucky scarf, a sports team is not going to win or lose, right? We know this. This is something that we know 100%. And yet, superstitions are a fact of human existence. And we have to understand why, right? So what is going on? Why do human beings believe in superstitions even though we know scientifically that they're false? And it turns out that we can harness this superstition circuitry, which is actually a cognitive bias in our favor. So let's take a quick look at the science. Moreover, asking people directly whether they are responsible for an outcome is notoriously problematic because of self-serving bias. People routinely report agency over positive events, but deny it over negative events, regardless of whether they actually caused those events. So this is basically talking about superstition. This amounts to an enhanced perceptual association between action and outcome, which presumably highlights the experience that one's actions cause the outcomes. Duh, right? When I do thing A, it causes thing B. So we're going to talk about why is Dr. K talking about this? So let's understand this. So the goal here is to shape your behavior, right? The goal here is to remove free will from the equation. So if I go to someone who is superstitious about wearing a particular scarf when their favorite team is playing, let's understand what's going on. There's a particular outcome in the outside world which then shapes their behavior. And then if I tell this person, hey, help me understand what the science of wearing the scarf is. The person is like, there is no science. And then I'll say, okay, fine, bro. So take it off. And they're like, no, never. I will never take it off. I will, no. And I'll tell me why. I don't know. I just won't do it. So let's just stop and think about this. This is not free will. Their fucking brain is telling them you cannot take off the scarf. And so this is the beautiful thing about superstition. We actually know the science through which superstitions form. It is a weird thing in our brain where we observe a particular outcome and then we kind of track it back to a particular action. And the beautiful thing about this is if we manipulate this behavior, we may be able to induce the same, not discipline, the same stubbornness of a superstition for positive behaviors. We can be very, very stubborn about our behaviors, and our behaviors feel very, very automatic. So let's understand how to harness this principle so that we can shape our behaviors and be stubbornly attached to something that we actually want to do. So let's take a look at that. To produce goal-directed action, the brain needs 3 essential processes: an action selection mechanism to select an action, a motor output mechanism to execute the action, and the monitoring mechanism to confirm that the goal has been achieved. Now, this is the last thing that really focuses on superstition. So if you look at how a superstition is formed, after an event happens, what people usually do is a post-mortem. So one day I'm wearing a scarf and my team wins, and I don't really think about it. The next time my team plays, they lose. And then I spend a lot of time thinking about it. I'm like, oh my God, they lost. Oh, I didn't wear my scarf. That's why they lost. It's not about the particular conclusion, and this is what I've seen from my high performers, is they spend a lot of time after an action is completed doing a post-mortem. What went wrong with this relationship? How did I screw up this presentation? What do I need to do to perform better in an interview? They spend a lot of time after the action is complete, monitoring and thinking about the outcome of the action. And what we know from research on superstition and volition is that the more time we spend dwelling on something, the more likely we are to re-engage in some kind of action. So this is where very practically what we want to do is spend time doing a post-mortem. And I encourage y'all to think about the times in your life when you screw up. And we may dwell on things in a very negative way, but if you're like me, we don't really dwell on, it's so hard to describe, but we don't really do a post-mortem, right? We don't really think about things in a very logical way. What we tend to do is actually avoid it. So anytime that I would take a test, for example, and the test did not go as well as I wanted, I was so frustrated that I would jump immediately into something else. If you break up with someone and there's a very, very bad breakup, let's get drunk and have a rebound. We don't spend any time doing a post-mortem. And what we literally do when I work with people who are low performers or less successful, what I force them to do in my office is a post-mortem. Let's unemotionally look at the situation. Let's not jump into a reflexive behavior. Let's just spend some time monitoring the outcome of our actions. And what I tend to find is there's 2 camps of people. One person who just jumps right into the next thing, once again, really short transition, and other people spend time doing a post-mortem. So you should absolutely do that. Now, a lot of people may be wondering, but what is the right way to do a post-mortem? And that's the crazy thing. There isn't a right way or wrong way. I mean, I guess the right way is to really think about it as logically as you can. But the research actually shows that it isn't a particular kind of post-mortem that leads to positive reinforcement in behavior. It is just the fact that you do a post-mortem. And this is kind of where we tap into this idea that your neurons are making their calculations. We just need to give them the space to make the calculations. The last thing that we're going to talk about is intentional binding. So anytime we take an action, there's a particular outcome. And we think that depending on the outcome, the action is reinforced or not reinforced. But now we understand through this concept of intentional binding that there are certain things that you can do to encourage the repeat of the action. So if I go to work out today, so I know this sounds kind of weird, but let's say that there are 2 people. Both of them go to the gym for the first time. Now, for one person, this is the first and the last time that they go to the gym for this year. But for the second person, this is the first of 100 times that they go to the gym this year. But at the end of that first day at the gym, both of these people are equal, right? But something changes between these two people. One person doesn't ever go again, and the second person decides, okay, this is great, I'm going to go again and again, but they don't actually decide. That's the whole point. There's no free will, there's no decision. Something happens in their brain that causes them to go again and again and again. And this is the concept of intentional binding. The more that we increase our intentional binding, the more that we will actually repeat behaviors. So now we're going to look at the neuroscience of how to increase intentional binding. And the crazy thing is that we all have these ideas of Pavlovian reinforcement. We have all these ideas that the first person who went to the gym has a negative experience, therefore this is not rewarded, therefore they don't go again. And the second person has some kind of reward that increases the action. This is the crazy thing, right? So when we think that, we think, okay, when I act, I need the right reward to re-engage the behavior, dopamine, and all this other crap. Turns out that isn't the case. Several studies confirm that the ability to choose among several possible actions increases intentional binding. So what does this mean? The first thing that increases intentional binding is having lots of choices. That's number one. Second thing is that, interestingly, this effect of free choice was found both when all possible actions led to the same outcome and when they led to different outcomes. So we're going to stop for a second and really digest what this means, because this is very different. So what this research suggests is that the outcome actually doesn't matter. If I give someone all the same choices, let's say I give them a choice of, do you want this piece of cake, or this piece of cake? And the cakes are all the same. We tend to think that it is the size of the cake that determines my decision. And if there are all equal outcomes, then there should be no reinforcement. But what the research on intentional binding shows us is that making a choice reinforces the behavior. It's not even the outcome of the choice. It is the fact that you stop and make a choice. This is absolutely true for high performers versus low performers. High performers stop between actions and consider all of their choices. Low performers jump from one thing to another. They don't consider all the options. They're just, I feel like doing this, so I'm going to do this. They actually try to avoid thinking about all of the choices. And what the research in intentional binding shows us is that simply pausing, reflecting, and selecting something increases the likelihood of the behavior. So let's apply this to something like exercise. Rushing to the gym is unlikely to result in a repeat of going to the gym. Sitting down for 5 minutes and asking yourself, okay, I want to exercise today. What are my options? If you go through this cognitive exercise, that cognitive exercise is sufficient to increase your intentional binding and make you more likely to go to the gym in the future. So let's look at one other aspect of intentional binding. In another study, compared conditions in which the same action choices either did or did not predict action outcomes. Intentional binding was stronger in the former than in the latter case. There is an element of behavioral reinforcement based on outcomes. When we go to the gym, if you have a good experience, you're more likely to go again. That's absolutely true. The key thing about intentional binding is that that's not the only thing involved, right? Which kind of makes sense, because if we sort of think about it, we'll sometimes do things in life where we do have a positive outcome. I went to the gym and I felt great, and yet we don't go again the next day. So what's missing? Why not? If there is that Pavlovian reinforcement, that is not sufficient to shape your behavior. So this is where intentional binding comes into play. So choosing between a lot of options is the other thing that increases intentional binding. And there's a third thing, which is making a prediction. It doesn't matter what the prediction is, but in that process of making a choice, if you stop and predict the outcomes, that process of making a prediction, whether that prediction is right or wrong, seems to increase intentional binding. So once again, what I see between high performers and low performers is low performers tend to not really think too much about the consequences of their actions. In fact, if you're like me, you avoid making predictions. You try very hard to not think about what the consequences of your actions are, because you know they're going to be bad. And if you know they're going to be bad, Why doesn't your brain avoid them? It's because we're missing this section of prediction. So anytime we make a prediction about the outcome, if I do this, what will happen tomorrow? Literally, that cognitive exercise increases intentional binding. So let's take a quick look at one last bit of research. So interestingly, DaCosta and colleagues did not find reliable differences in intentional bindings between rewarded and unrewarded actions. So this is the point that I made earlier. This is very interesting, right? So whether the action turns out good or not does not affect intentional binding. The most important things is considering all of your choices and making predictions. Those are the two things that actually correlate with an increase in behavior. Now, I realize I've made a lot of weird contradictory statements. So I said, on the one hand, the reward doesn't matter, the outcome doesn't matter. On the other hand, there is Pavlovian conditioning. So like, what's the deal here, Dr. K? How the fuck does this work? So what I'm pointing out to y'all is that if we look at people who are successful or unsuccessful, what's the difference? So what we tend to find is that successful people, it's not the outcome itself, which there may be some degree of reinforcement. And remember that sometimes studies can have conflicting findings, right? So how can we make sense of this? So this is what I've observed. When people are very successful, they utilize these principles of intentional binding without even realizing it. They pause and they think through things before they act. They make intentional predictions. They stop and think about what the consequences of their actions are going to be. Whereas unsuccessful people don't do that. Right? What they actually try doing is avoiding predictions. And if we look at this study and we say that, hold on a second, the study is telling us that the important thing to reinforce behavior is not the outcome, it is the prediction. Does that track with your experience? Does that track with what I have seen in my office? Absolutely. Because sometimes things go well for people who are lazy, but they don't change their behavior. And sometimes things go poorly for people who are highly successful, but they keep trying. So if we stop and think about it, it's not the outcome that is significant and alone, the only thing that reinforces the behavior. There are other factors at play. And it turns out that the research on intentional binding tells us what those are, and it tracks perfectly. Some people make predictions. Some people make intentional choices. Some people follow whatever the fuck they feel like doing and try to avoid thinking about the consequences of their actions. And those are the things that correlate with success or failure. So, just to summarize, there's this idea that our behavior is deterministic. There's no choice. You don't get to decide what you do. Your brain makes a decision up to 10 seconds before you even realize it. And I also see this in my patients who have addictions. When I really tunnel down and I talk to them, they know they've made the decision to relapse before they consciously make the decision to relapse. Their brain is decided for them. So does that mean you're fucked? Does that mean you can't control your life at all? Well, let's see if we can actually program ourselves in the right way, which gets into some weird paradox of, is this actually free will or is this programming? Is it possible that simply watching this video has planted a seed in your mind and that your Bereitschaftspotential is starting already to move in the right way? I don't know. We don't have a final answer, but let's hope so. There are a couple of principles which you can absolutely engage in, which will correlate with improved behaviors. The first is take advantage of the Bereitschaftspotential, which is give yourself time in transitions. The second thing that we want to do is harness avoidance instead of conquer it. Avoid the wait. Avoid dealing with it tomorrow. Try to save yourself the trouble of dealing with this crap and just get it done, right? Like a Band-Aid, one movement, take it right off. This is what successful people do. The third thing that we really want to focus on is a monitoring mechanism for the outcome of our actions. The more time we spend doing a post-mortem, the more these illogical and controlling superstitious circuits in our brain will activate, the easier it will be to act in a stupid way in the future. So we have to be a little bit careful there, because if you don't do the postmortem in the right way, you can sort of arrive at the wrong conclusions. But we absolutely do know that spending more time is better than spending less time. The last thing that we want to consider is this concept of intentional binding, where if you consider your choices and make a prediction, these two things will reinforce the behavior. It is not the outcome itself. So a lot of people will wonder, oh, why should I bother doing this? This didn't work. This didn't work. This didn't work. How do I keep going? How do I keep going? How do I motivate myself? And it turns out that what you need to do is just have lots of choices and make predictions, and those will increase your intentional binding. So I hope this has been helpful to y'all. I know it's kind of weird, but let's just stop and think for a second. If there's no such thing as free will, we should be able to program our brains. And what I really want y'all to do is try this stuff, right? Maybe it's not even your choice anymore. So go ahead and implement it. Do as much of this as you can and report back.